origins of the Vietnam War date back to the end of World War II, with the surrender of Japanese-occupied forces in August of 1945. That's when Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese revolutionary, founded the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or Viet Minh, in the capital of Hanoi. France had many issues with this, as they refused to relinquish their former colony and wanted to maintain control over the land. In November of 1946, after months of failed negotiations, the French Navy bombed the port city of Haiphong following a confrontation over customs control, resulting in over 6,000 deaths. The Viet Minh retaliated by launching a massive attack against French military installations in Hanoi, which began the First Indochina War. Known internationally as the French Indochina War, aided by China and supported by America funding to France, the war raged on until the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. This led to the Geneva Conference, which temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with a planned 1956 election to reunify the nation. However, the U.S. did not fully endorse the Geneva Accords, largely because of fear that mandated elections would result in the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia. South Vietnam refused as well, because the government feared that Ho Chi Minh's popularity among the public would very likely secure a communist victory, creating a domino effect. As a result, the country was split into two sides: Communist North, Viet Minh, and non-communist South, later to be known as the Republic of Vietnam. The non-communist South was under the rule of dictator Ngo Dinh Diem and was backed by the United States. The end of the Geneva Conference also resulted in countries Cambodia and Laos gaining independence, requiring all remaining French and Viet Minh troops to retreat from the former and the latter. Unfortunately, the refusal by South Vietnam to hold the elections resulted in a rebellion, leading to a civil war fought between South Vietnamese government and the Viet Minh. On June 1, 1954, the Saigon military mission was launched under the command of U.S. Air Force Colonel Edward Lansdale. This mission was a covert spy operation to conduct psychological warfare and is widely considered to be the official start of the Vietnam War. In November of 1955, the United States deployed the first personnel of military assistance, known as the Military Assistance Advisory Group, to train Vietnamese soldiers, marking the first official U.S. involvement in the war. South Vietnam, now being backed by both China and the Soviet Union, began working on a route through Laos and Cambodia to supply and support ongoing guerrilla attacks against South Vietnam. This route would come to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 2 months later, in July of 1959, two U.S. advisors, Major Dale Arboise and Sergeant Chester M. Bovin, were caught in a hail of gunfire when the MAAG launched an attack on a compound in Bien Hoa, which was located about 20 miles northeast of Saigon. This was the very first attack on U.S. personnel during the war, and because the names of the fallen veterans are in chronological order on the Vietnam Memorial, Boise and Oven are among the very first names inscribed on the famous wall. In September 1960, Ho Chi Minh, in declining health, was replaced by Lee Duan as the head of North Vietnam, and later that December, the National Liberation Front, or the NLF, is formed with North Vietnam as the political wing of the anti-government insurgency in enemy territory. The United States saw the NLF as an arm of Viet Minh and began referring to them as the Viet Cong, short for Vietnamese Cong Sen, which in English translates to Vietnamese Communists. In 1961, President Kennedy approved more than 400 special force troops and hundreds of other advisors to begin covert spy operations against the Viet Cong. And in May of that year, over 300 helicopters and 400 Green Berets were deployed to South Vietnam to carry out these operations. Green Berets was a term used to describe highly specialized U.S. forces known for conducting missions of counterterrorism, unconventional warfare, and training foreign guerrilla forces such as those in South Vietnam. In January 1962, the United States launched a herbicidal warfare program known as Operation Ranch Hand. For some context, months earlier, in August of 1961, the South Vietnamese government requested that the United States be an assistant for using aerial homicides to clear vegetation. Following intense debates, President Kennedy authorized a limited experiment using military herbicides in South Vietnam. This experiment would later evolve into Agent Orange.
Agent Orange, Operation Ranch Hand, 1962 to 1971, the Vietnam War.
During the Ranch Hand operation, U.S. troops sprayed more than 20 million herbicides across 4.5 million acres of Vietnam. Over 13 million gallons of Agent Orange, or almost two-thirds of the total amount of herbicides used in the entire war. Agent Orange actually got its name from the distinctive orange stripe that was painted around the 55-gallon storage drums. The U.S. military also had 5 other herbicides codenamed with different colors: green, blue, pink, purple, and white. Because much of Vietnam is surrounded by mangrove forests, which are highly sensitive to herbicides, a single spraying was enough to kill all the trees. This is also due to a highly toxic byproduct known as TCDD, or 2378 tetrachlorodibenzo P-dioxin. Exposure to dioxin can result in various hazards to human health, including disruption of the endocrine system, which can lead to stuff like decreased fertility and endometriosis. A chronic inflammatory condition with lining similar to a woman's uterus can grow outside of it, which may even result in a miscarriage. Other hazards include higher risk rates of certain cancers, damage to the immune system, skin disease, and cardiovascular disease. Due to the highly effective chemicals used in Agent Orange, millions, maybe even billions of people were exposed. While the exact number of those affected by the substance remains unknown, an estimated 3 million American soldiers who served at that time were exposed, or may have been exposed to the herbicide, as well as 3 million Vietnamese citizens. Things began to take a darker turn when, on November 2nd, 1963, Ngo Dinh Diem was assassinated by his own generals while in an armored personnel carrier as part of a co-op diat, or overthrowing of the government, by a small group. 20 days later, President John F. Kennedy would be assassinated as well. Following Kennedy's death, President Lyndon B. Johnson took aggressive action, escalating the war from a regional advisory to a full-scale American conflict. On August 2, 1964, 2 U.S. destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS C. Turner Joy, were destroyed in a torpedo attack by 3 Vietnamese torpedo boats. The first attack occurred at about 2:40 p.m., and a second attack is said to have been reported as well, but many speculate that that never actually happened. President Johnson essentially used the incident as an excuse to secure a broad congressional mandate for war. He then took things further by deploying over 500,000 troops and used the Tonkin Gulf Resolution to obtain congressional approval and heighten military involvement further without formal declaration of war. He also approved several bombing campaigns, and on March 2, 1965, President Johnson authorized the first of these campaigns, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. The goal of Rolling Thunder was to discourage the Hanoi regime's direction and support of the insurgency that threatened to destroy the Republic of Vietnam. The operation had 5 distinct phases, each centered around destroying different resources. Phase 1 focused on several targets, including barracks and radar sites. Phase 2 targeted transportation, including boats, bridges, and railroads. Phase 3 focused on POL resources. Phase 4 targeted industrial facilities, and Phase 5 focused on what remained of North Vietnam's industrial infrastructure. Over 58,000 troops were lost, and by this point, many Americans, including President Johnson himself, considered the war to be absolutely unwinnable. It was also at this time that things regarding Vietnam had become so intense, protests began to rise. As the war's death toll began to go up, many young men reacted by burning their draft cards and striking against foreign policy and warmongering. There was also immense protests against the brutal tactics being used, including psychological warfare. This included the use of napalm, which was a jellied gasoline that would burn up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Although its use in warfare originates back to the Second World War and even Korea, roughly 380,000 gallons of it were dropped on Vietnam between 1963 and 1973, making it the most extensive use of napalm ever used in a war. There was also the Tet Offensive, which occurred in January 1968. Tet is a Vietnamese holiday that is celebrated on the New Year, and in the early morning hours of January 31st, North Vietnam deployed over 85,000 troops in an attack against 5 Vietnamese cities. This ultimately shattered America's confidence in the war, and more massive anti-war protests soon emerged. This not only turned the public's perception, but also the media, with Walter Cronkite famously saying in a news report,
"Now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate."
Back in Nam, the men of the 11th Brigade American Division entered into the Vietnamese village of My Lai in what would come to be known as the My Lai Massacre. On March 16, 1968, over 500 innocent civilians, including women and children, were murdered at the hands of Army First Lieutenant William Cawley. Later, Cawley would be convicted of his horrific crimes, but given that he was the only person held criminally responsible, his sentence was reduced from life in prison to 10 years confinement. Likewise, many argued that he was being used as a scapegoat by a military reestablishment that was responsible for putting young men in impossible situations. As a result of the atrocity, all confidence in the public regarding the U.S. Armed Forces and government was completely lost. To make things even worse, the event was not publicly announced until the next year. It was a successful military cover-up, and just 11 months into Nixon's presidency, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh officially broke the story. In Cambodia, in order to destroy North Vietnamese military sanctuaries, the United States launched a series of joint military operations along with the South Republic of Vietnam. Over 30,000 U.S. troops and more than 40,000 South Vietnamese troops invaded communist sanctuaries, destroying supply depots and disrupting operations. This was intentionally done in order to buy time for the eventual U.S. withdrawal. In the United States, this was further intensified with the tragedy of the Kent State shootings.
15. And then the guards shot some tear gas up on the hill to disperse the crowd, and the kids picked it up and threw it back.
On May 4th, 1970, during a rally opposing the Cambodian invasion at Kent University in Ohio, 28 National Guard soldiers fired around 67 rounds in 13 seconds, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. In its immediate aftermath, the university was immediately closed, along with several other colleges across the country. The Ohio National Guard testified and had to pay a total of $675,000 to those injured in the event. It also tilted public opinion against the war, and many speculate that it played a role in Nixon's downfall and eventual resignation. In January of 1973, following several more operations and the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which leaked classified government information regarding the war, the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam signed a document to establish peace and official and U.S. involvement. Known as the Paris Accords, these documents would officially end all U.S. involvement, leaving North and South Vietnam to fight on their own. Due to the war's crippling financial costs, as well as the intense uprising of anti-war protests in the United States, the Nixon administration in North Vietnam, in the midst of a catastrophic military stalemate, had secretly pursued negotiations for years this entire time. The document, which also led to Operation Homecoming, saw the withdrawal of U.S. troops as well as 591 American prisoners, including future U.S. Senator John McCain. It's also worth noting that over a decade earlier, Kennedy had actually planned a separate pullout, but following his death and Johnson's inauguration, he kept them in. Nonetheless, Johnson would later pass away on January 22, 1973, at the age of 64, and on the same day as the Paris Peace Accords were signed, the United States Selective Services announced the end of the draft, instituting an all-volunteer military. Nixon officially resigns in August 1974 due to the controversy surrounding Watergate and his involvement in Vietnam. The fall of Saigon by North Vietnamese forces officially unified the nations under hardline communist rule, effectively bringing the conflict to a depressing end. Today, the Vietnam War is remembered as a turbulent era, to say the least, and until Afghanistan, it was the longest, most grueling war in American history. Over 58,220 Americans killed, 250,000 South Vietnamese, and 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, all of whom sacrificed their lives in a traumatic, eventful, and bloody era.